It's a special privilege to speak to your association. Walter Brueggemann is a Protestant theologian. He wrote a book called The Prophetic Imagination. And in it he says that transformational vision occurs at the intersection of two things. One is a clear view of the world's hurt, of its need for change, of its problems. But the other, he says, it's coupled with hope, a sense of the world's promise and possibilities. And it's the intersection of the two that creates the energy for change and for transformational change and visionary change. When do we really need leadership? Is it when everything's working? Is it when everything's just fine, no problems, right? No dilemmas, no difficult choices? Is that when we need leadership? Isn't it when the problems come? When do people say, "Where's the leadership?" Isn't it when we're confronted with new challenges? In reality, if you think about it for a moment, the domain of leadership is not certainty, it's uncertainty. That's the ground within which leadership operates, is the domain of uncertainty. It's not about how can you control everything, because you can't. But it's how you can engage with the unexpected and the uncertain and find purpose in it. And that's pretty challenging stuff, because it's to accept that, you know, things are never going to be completely under control. They can't be. Otherwise, we wouldn't need the leadership. And so it poses a lot of questions, like a challenge to the hands. Can I find the skills I need to deal with this new situation? It's a challenge to the head. Can I use my resources in new ways to deal with these challenges? It's a strategic challenge. And then there's the challenge to the heart. How do I find the courage? How do I find the hopefulness? How do I inspire hopefulness and courage in others necessary to take the risks that we have to take in order to achieve our purpose? So the definition that I've come to use for leadership is that it's about accepting responsibility, number one, because there's a choice involved. Accepting responsibility for enabling others. So this is leadership as relationship. This is not leadership as doing for. It's enabling others. And so it's thinking of leadership more as a practice than it is a position. We all know of circumstances in which people occupy positions of authority, but I don't know if it's ever happened to you, but I've noticed that sometimes there's people in positions of authority that don't exercise very good leadership. I've also met a lot of people exercising leadership from kitchen tables and in workplaces and in neighborhoods that don't have those positions of authority, but they exercise damn good leadership. The way I was introduced to leadership, though, was particularly in the form of organizing. And for me, organizing is a form of leadership that begins by asking not what's my issue, but who are my people? And what's the problems that they face from their perspective? And how can I work with them to enable them to use their resources to develop the capacity or power they need to solve their problems? So it's not about working with people as clients. You know, that word client comes from the Latin inclinare, which means to lean upon. It's about one who is dependent upon another. That's not what this is about. That's not what organizing is about. And it's not about marketing products to customers. That's an exchange. That's not what organizing is about either. It's about relationship building, and it's about building relationships with people so as to transform a community into a constituency. And I know constituency has a special meaning, political meaning, but the word comes from Latin, and the two words that make it up, constare, means to stand together. So it is like working with people so that they can stand together. Stand together, decide together, act together to achieve their purposes together. In any measure of inequality, whites were here and blacks were here, was housing, healthcare, education, you name it. But it wasn't enough to sort of say what's wrong and bring some medical supplies or a few books. That wasn't going to solve anything. That was work of charity. And we learned that there was something different, which was work of justice, because justice requires that you not say what's wrong, but why is it wrong? Why is it that way? And when we began to ask the question of why, well, African Americans didn't have the right to vote. No political power. Economically, not protected under the labor laws as agricultural workers and domestic workers. And I'd never had the experience of going up to somebody twice my age who would stand up offer me his chair, call me mister, introduce himself with his first name and not look me in the eye because he was black and I was white. And that went on thousands of times a day across the South between blacks and whites. And you put together the economic and the political and the cultural powerlessness, and you get some answers about why it was. But when you start raising the power question, people get very uncomfortable. Because it usually means that the reason some people are suffering has to do with other people benefiting. That's just how it happens to be. And they don't want change, and they don't like change. And so we knew we had a power problem, but how were we going to deal with it? Now, some people thought, well, you go where the power is, right? You go to, in our case, Washington, D.C. In those days, at least, you thought there was some power there. We have a different reality these days, I think. And you know how that went. We go to Washington, D.C. Hi, could we have a little bit of your power to fix this problem down here? Well, you can imagine how that went. It's like, you know, come and testify before our committee, do some more research, we need more data, you know, all that. So it became very clear that unless the people with the problem could also become authors of the solution to the problem, it was not going to get solved. It wasn't going to get solved. And so how do you do that? If the problem is that people don't have power, and the solution is that they have power, then how do you get some power? Well, we learned there's a difference between resources and power. And we learned that while many communities lack resources, they're not all lack power, they're not all lacking in resources. And what do I mean? Everybody heard of Rosa Parks? You know, the lady that one day got tired, didn't get up and give her seat? Yeah, except she was a trained organizer. She was secretary of the NAACP chapter. She'd been trained at Highlander School in organizing, and it was all a strategy. It was all a strategy. Because that community had been inspired by the Supreme Court that had said the year before that segregation in schools was unconstitutional. They were going to try to do it on buses because the way the buses worked in Montgomery were blacks in the back, whites in the front, and you got up on the bus, you passed an armed deputized bus driver who was armed to defend that distinction. Went by all the roads with white people, got a place to sit, and if a white person needed that seat, well, then you had to get up and give it to him. Twice a day, going to work, coming home from work, that'd build up a little anger, wouldn't it? People want to change that. Nothing abstract about that, very, very real. And so they said, well, we're going to file a lawsuit, and we need a good plaintiff, and so Rosa, you're going to be the plaintiff, and you know, you're going to get arrested. But the problem is when she got arrested, not the problem, the women's committee at the college there, led by a woman named Joanne Robinson, said, we can't let Rosa go to jail by herself. We've got to show some solidarity. So let's see if we can get everybody to stay off the buses for one day. And they went to Dr. King and the others and said, can we do it for one day? Well, the next morning, Dr. King describes getting up early to see on the buses. They leafleted the churches and did all that to see what was going to happen. And bus after bus went by, not a single black face on the buses, and the community looked at itself in a whole new way. So, wow, look, we can stick together, because when you don't have power, you don't think you can stick together. That began to change things. And then they discovered they had a source of power that they didn't find by looking up. When you look down, what do you see? What do you see? What part of your anatomy do you see? Your feet. Turned out everybody in that community had feet. Now, if they used those feet to walk to work instead of getting on the bus, if one person did it, no difference. Bus company not going to miss that bus fare if everybody did it. All of a sudden, the resource they had, bus fare and feet, turned into power, but it turned into power because they used it together. And they revealed the fact that all power systems depend on the cooperation of those whom they exploit. That was Gandhi's whole insight. All power is interdependent. We cooperate with it, which means that at any point we can say no. And if we say no together, then it turns out the tables get turned. That's what happens. And that was the powerful lesson to come out of the civil rights movement. And that, for me, was what organizing was about. How people, ordinary people, could use their resources in new ways to create the power they needed to change their circumstances of life. And yes, it took personal courage, but it also took community. It took working together and acting together. The first thing that I've come to be very clear about when it comes to organizing and leadership is that fundamentally, it's about relationships. Now, that may not seem too shocking. How many people have ever had a relationship here? Let me see. Come on, be honest. See, a lot of the organizing skills that we need are things we already know how to do, but we know them implicitly. And what we can do through training and leadership development is take the implicit, make it explicit, so we can be intentional and purposeful about how we go about doing those things. And relationship building is one of those. You know, and see, there's a lot of confusion these days between marketing and movement building. So when I talk about relationship building, I'm not talking about branding, I'm not talking about messaging, I'm not talking about advertising soap. I'm talking about the way in which people make commitments to each other around a common purpose or a common cause or a common effort. I mean, this is one of those areas where the social media can be very confusing. Because sometimes, you know, clicking is not the same thing as entering into a relationship with somebody. And there's a scholar at the University of North Carolina who's done some really interesting work on this. You know, these bubbles there's been like in Turkey and Brazil and, well, even in Egypt, where there's a lot of people mobilized, and they say, oh, the social media mobilized everybody. And then what happens? It goes away. See, to turn out the millions of people, the numbers of people that were turning out in Egypt, in Tahrir Square, in that effort, you would have had to build an organization with leadership and structure and the capacity. Social media made it easy. Everybody show up. Well, everybody showed up. But who turned out to benefit from it? Not the folks that showed up because they hadn't done the organizing work. It was all mobilizing without organizing. The people who benefited were the Muslim brothers in the army. And so mobilizing and organizing are not the same thing. And to benefit from mobilization, we have to do it through organization. And that's rooted in relationship building. And I really want to make that point. Social media is very valuable for sharing information. It is not a substitute for organizing. And it's not a substitute for the work of building relationships that we need to do with one another. And and I'm speaking as somebody that teaches over the internet. So, you know, and the one-on-one's just the beginning, because, you know, you have a one-on-one with somebody, then guess what? They know other people, don't they? And then you build a network. And we call that house meetings. That's how we were all trained in house meetings. You get somebody, invite their friends, right? And then you go, and then each of them, you have like Tupperware party. You know, it's the same idea. You make a chain. Now, it's kind of funny, except that was the foundation for getting Nancy Pelosi elected the first time in San Francisco. It was a foundation for building a winning organization for Dean in New Hampshire. It was a foundation for building Obama's organization in South Carolina, because what it means is you don't have to depend on institutions to get to people. People get to other people. And so you can build from the bottom up through relationship building that you can't do when you depend. Does this make sense, I'm saying? So that's number one. Number two, leadership requires learning how to translate values into the emotional resources that enable us to respond to challenges with courage, not fear. Now, that's the work of storytelling. See, what stories are about how we learn to access the emotional capacity that we need, sources of courage, sources of hope that we need in order to respond to a challenge. Not react with fear like we're hardwired to do, you know, fight, flight, freeze, you know, run away, strike out, or else, you know, hope that it won't notice us, you know, the freeze thing. But how to respond, not react with fear, but respond by asking questions, by getting information, by engaging. Now, to engage the head, though, the heart's got to be in the right place. Because if the heart is fearful, that's what we're doing. We're running from it. How many times do unexpected things happen to you in a day? Little things. You know, no parking, whatever it might. And then there's the big things, like marriages break up, like we lose loved ones, we lose jobs, things for which we're not prepared. In fact, isn't it core to being a human being and living in the world with this gift of being able to anticipate the future and remember the past, that we're confronted with these challenges for which we're not ready. We can't be ready for them by definition. And they're scary. And we seem to be infinitely curious about how do we deal with that? How do we get the courage? How do we sustain faith? How do we find the creativity to confront that? And see, in a story, because we can identify empathetically with the protagonist in the story, we get the meaning of the story, not just in terms of haste makes waste. We experience it. We're actually there. We know now through the brain research, this works through mirror neurons. We understand now kind of how this works. But we're there. And so we don't just get this proposition, we learn through experiencing it, and so the moral that a story teaches is to the heart, not to the head alone. I mean, think about, where did you hear your first stories? Who told you your first stories? Yeah, did they go to professional storytelling school and all that? Or you? No. There's been research, 85% of the time parents spend with young children in storytelling. What are they doing? They're just trying to keep them busy? Trying to teach. Trying to teach. Let me tell you about Uncle Charlie. Uncle Charlie started out okay, but then he took this wrong turn. We don't want to be like Uncle Charlie, but Aunt Harriet over here, she got it right. Every family all over the world has those stories. They're teaching kids. But what are they teaching them? How to deal with challenges, how to deal with problems, how to make choices, and how to find the emotional resources, and I say emotional resources, to deal with challenges. Not just the strategy, but the strength of the heart. Because values, if you really think about it, values aren't abstract ideas. Values are how we feel about things. How many people here have ever had an experience of hurt, of pain? How about experiences of hope? See, if you hadn't had the pain, you wouldn't think the world needed changing. If you didn't have the hope, you wouldn't think you could. And it's that combination that equips every single person here with the capacity to teach, and to teach from your own stories. When people came, we did these Camp Obamas to train volunteers for that campaign. When people came to those, they said, we're going to learn Obama's story. We said, no, you're going to learn your own story. You're going to do the work to go back and reflect on those experiences that shaped who you are, so you can share them with other people so they will get you. And then that's how you're going to make Obama interesting, through you, your story of self. And that's how you begin to build a story of us and a story of now. Does this make sense? Yes. Now let me say something about the head. Leadership can't stop by asking why. It also has to grapple with how. How do we turn what we have, our resources, into what we need, power, to get what we want, change, an objective? And to me, that's what strategy is. Strategy is nothing more than how we turn what we have into what we need to get what we want. And again, just like storytelling, just like relationship building, we do it all the time. How many people had to strategize about something this morning? I mean, maybe you overslept, and so you had to figure out what to do about that. All the time. See, we're purposeful creatures, so we conceive purpose, and then those purposes get interfered. There's blocks come in the way. And then we got to figure out, how are we going to get around it? That's all strategy is. See, sometimes it's made so complex because sometimes there's folks that we want to do all the strategy and everybody else just implement. You know what I'm talking about? I'm sure you do, because in workplaces it happens no, we're the strategists. You just do what you're told. But that's not how human beings, we're learning creatures. We learn, we make mistakes and we can learn from those, and we have success and we can learn from that, and that equips us to be strategists too. And social movements succeed to the extent that they distribute the strategy and the work of strategy out there among everybody. You know the story of David and Goliath? Well, I'm just going to, Goliath's a big warrior. The Philistines and the Israelites are having at it. That's been going on for a while. And so the Philistines send their powerful warrior Goliath, and he says, I'm Goliath, and send your champion to face me, and if I beat him, then you're ours, but if he beats me, then we're yours. And what happens? The Israelites, they're all looking at their feet. They got to go clean their rooms. They got to do whatever, but they're not going to take this on. It goes on for day after day after day, and finally this guy named Jesse sends his youngest son, David, who is a shepherd, not a warrior, to bring lunch to his brothers. and who are warriors. And so David shows up with lunch. He's got the lunch there. He's passing out to his brothers. And that's when Goliath comes out. And Goliath starts doing his yo mamas, or however you want to describe it. He starts calling out to everybody. And David is, but everybody's saying nothing. And David's outraged. He says, wait a second. This is an insult to the ranks of the living God. We got to do something. And his brothers say, cool it, kid. Just shut up. Don't make trouble. No, we got to do something. He goes to the king. He says, King Saul, let me go fight Goliath. And what does the king say? You're but a youth. He's been a warrior since his youth. You know, you don't have the skills. You haven't been to the Kennedy School, or, you know, you haven't been to the leadership training, you know, whatever it is. You know, you don't have the skills. And David says, well, maybe not, but look, I'm what you got, so you better go with me. So the king says, oh, okay, but on one condition. You got to take my sword, my shield, my helmet. You got to put those on because you're going to need those weapons to face this powerful warrior. And what does David do? He agrees. He puts them on. And he gets them on, and they're too heavy. He can't move. That's when he looks down to his feet and he notices 5 smooth stones down there. He says, wait a second, I'm a shepherd, not a soldier. As a shepherd, I knew how to protect my flock from the wolf and from the bear. It wasn't with the sword and a shield, it was with a stone and a sling. Maybe Goliath's just another wolf, just another bear. And that's when he takes off all that armor, picks up those stones, puts them in his little pouch, goes to face Goliath. And what does Goliath do? Ha, ha, ha. Am I a dog? You send a boy with a stick. Ha. Third ha, stone in the middle of the forehead, into Goliath. Now, this is not a story about nonviolence, but it is a story about strategy. Because now, just think about it for a minute. When does the action really begin? What does it begin with? What does it really begin with? Does it begin with sending out to McKinsey for a 5-year strategic plan on how to defeat giants? What does it begin with? It begins with David's outrage. It begins with David's experience of injustice and a decision that I got to do something. I don't know what yet, I got to do something. And that puts his feet on the path of learning, of figuring it out. And until we're on that path of learning, we're not going to come up with the answers to these things. We're never gonna know enough. And so he goes to the king, and the king, what do they always say? Oh, you're going to fight the powerful ones? Well, you need what they got, so you need to spend as much money as they do on television, or you need to, do the mail that they do, or you need to do good advice? Maybe not, because you know what? They got more of it, and they've been at it longer. And it takes David a while to get that and say, well, wait a second. No, I got to build strategy not out of what they have, but what I have. What are my resources? Fourth, action. Hands. So we've been doing heart, we've been doing head, we're doing hands now, and action. Now, the outcome of an election is decided by counting votes. Organizing, to me, is real to the extent that it elicits commitments of real resources to the tasks at hand. Time or money or skill or talent or responsibility. But the action, the resources that's required for action are that concrete and that specific and that real, and it always starts with commitments. Commitments that can be counted, that can be measured. I told you we were all trained in organizing. If you can't count it, it didn't happen. How many people came to the meeting? Well, how come only 6 when 8 said they'd be there? What happened to the other 2? That's how we were trained. Not to be mean, but because that was learning. That's a source of learning. It's not just like, oh, you don't trust me. It's not about trust. It's about, well, what can we learn about why those 2 people didn't show up? See, then we got something to learn from, because over here they all showed up, over here they didn't. So now let's learn about how that happened. We can't do that if we're not counting. And then it comes back down, though, to commitments, to real commitments. You know, there's Irving Goffman, the sociologist, very interesting guy. He wrote an article called Facework, and he describes a situation where I'm having lunch with somebody and they spill soup on their shirt. And I act like I didn't see it. And they see that I saw, but they act like they didn't see that I saw. And I see that they saw that I saw, but I act like I didn't see that. What? You know what I'm talking about? It's a little conspiracy not to embarrass each other. How many times do we do that when we say, I need to count on you to come to the meeting? Oh, I'll try. Oh, that's a yes. You know what I'm talking about? See, there's tension. And we fear that tension. And unless we get the courage to get into that tension, to require choices, because that's what it's all about. That's where commitment comes from, and then commitment builds all the rest. Last thing I want to mention then is about structure. How do we structure all this? How do we create structure that can support these practices in action? And my experience has been that volunteer efforts often flounder due to a failure to develop reliable, consistent, and creative individual local leaders. So we tried something different in the Obama campaign with the volunteer organization at the base. You know, we looked around at different ways to organize leadership. Now, it's very interesting. There's a symphony orchestra in New York called the Orpheus Chamber Orchestra, talented musicians who didn't want to be cogs in some music director's machine, and so they organized themselves an orchestra with no conductor. It's a great orchestra. They make great music. How do they exercise leadership? Leadership teams. They build teams. Real teams, not fake teams, not like, hey, we're all a team. The kind of team that plays hockey, or the kind of team that plays soccer, the kind of team where every position counts, where you know who's on the team and you know who's off the team, and you got the rules that govern how that team is going to work. See, the social science is really good on this. We know what it takes to make teams work. They got to be bounded, they got to be stable, they got to be governed by themselves, they got to share rules. You know those deals of having meetings and every week somebody else shows up and the ones that were there last time don't come and all that? That's just crazy stuff. You never build anything that way. So, 5 practices. Building relationships, that's the foundation. Doing the work of the heart, that's the storytelling. Doing the work of the head, that's the strategizing. Doing the work of the hands, that's turning things into concrete, specific action, and then designing a structure to support all that so that it makes the best use of people's time and resources and doesn't waste them, but also is real about the fact that, when people think leadership is just all about doing it on your own, that's not how it works. It's a myth. It's a myth. Dr. King did it all by himself. That's not, he had a team. Everybody had a team. And so it's a question about building those kind of teams, recognizing we are interdependent with others if we're going to be able to achieve what we want to achieve.